Okay, as you can see, I've done a really simple outline here. I've taped my watercolour paper onto my watercolour board to stop it from buckling, and the paper that I'm using is a cold press 300 GSM paper. Now I've done a trace down of the line drawing like this by printing out my photograph and just scribbling on the back, but of course you can draw it freehand. It's just a simple way of doing it if you'd like to press on with the painting. So here are the colours that I'm using for today's tutorial, which is a full-length tutorial with no time-lapse: Indigo, Raw Umber, Burnt Umber, Vandyke Brown, Light Red and Yellow Ochre, and I will link everything in the description box underneath this video, including the brushes that I'm going to be using today. These are my spotter brushes, which have a shorter bristle, and I think they make paint application very easy. This is my flat synthetic brush along with my very old spotter, which I use to mix the paint up. The flat synthetic brush is really good for removing any errors and also blending the paint. This is the colour chart that I use to match my colours, and if you'd like to make your own, I will link a card on the top of your screen so that you can do that. And we'll begin by mixing a watery mix of raw umber. Now this tutorial is suitable whatever your ability in painting, whether you're new to watercolour painting or whether you're slightly more advanced. And I would say that if you are new to watercolour painting, I would highly recommend that you watch this video all the way through so that you can see how the process unfolds. Now to begin with, I'm mixing a watery mix of raw umber like this, and we are going to start by working wet in wet. I'm also mixing a tiny puddle of indigo because I did feel there was an element of grey on some of the areas of the leaf. So to begin with, we are working wet in wet, and I'm using my number 4 spotter brush. Wet in wet simply means that you apply the water where you want to drop the paint. And we're going to be taking the water, in this instance for the first wash, all over the leaf like this. Now because this is a cold pressed paper and it's fairly robust, it means like I can be a little less gentle with it, shall we say. This particular paper is made by Arches and it's a really good quality paper. So I'm dropping in the indigo, as you can see here, where I felt the leaf had a kind of bluey grey tone to it. So the initial wash will just be to put our template washes in place so that we can build up those lovely watercolours to a stronger degree a little later on. Notice how I'm dropping in the colour just with the tip of my brush and letting the paint splurge into that damp paper like this, making sure that I stay within the pencil line. So this is my kind of learn to paint as you paint approach to watercolour painting. So if you're new to painting and you're really not sure where to start, sometimes if you create a painting that you can be proud of, it really boosts your confidence, and this is how I learned to paint myself. Because the paper is wet, it just means that it makes this first wash or the first application of paint a little bit easier. It just gives you the ability to maneuver the paint in a way that perhaps would be a little more tricky if you were using wet on dry, as I am for this very small area here on the stalk. As the paint settles into the paper, notice how I'm using the tip of my brush to manipulate that paint into place and still dropping in some colour where I feel it is needed for this underwash. You'll also notice that I've got a very small puddle of water on my little palette here. The reason I do this is quite simply because sometimes when you dip your brush into the jar of water, you can flood the brush with water and it sometimes makes your paint bloom. It's just a little tip there. So I'm now moving on to the next layer of paint, having made sure that my first wash is dry. So I'm mixing here a layer of burnt umber to a slightly thicker consistency and also adding a tiny bit of Vandyke brown. Now at this stage the paint should be slightly thicker and more gloopy in texture, as you can see here. This is really important and helps with the paint application process. So as I said, making sure that that paint is dry, we can now go on with our second wash. Once again, working wet in wet, but before I do that, I've noticed that as the paint retracts, sometimes you have a little tide mark where it pulls away from the pencil line. And of course, I've gone slightly outside the pencil line here, so I'm using my flat brush. This will just be damp and I'll just manipulate it like this and then pat it off with a kitchen roll, which usually means that it rectifies the error. Of course, it depends on the paint that you use, but in this instance, it's just fine. So if you don't like that dried tide mark effect, you can also use this flat synthetic brush just to blend it into the paper. Now, it really doesn't matter too much at this stage, but I think it's kind of good practice just to sort out those messy edges before we proceed. So once I'm happy with that and that paint has dried, where we've wet the paper, just go in with the glaze number 2 and wet the paper again, once again working wet and wet. You'll notice though, this time I'm working around that little fold because I don't want to drop the paint or the pigment into that at the moment. Giving that paint a moment or two to settle, you can see how I'm dropping in this pigment. Now, I do provide you with a free line drawing and reference photograph to accompany this tutorial, and if you'd like access to those, just head over to our Facebook group and I will link it in the description box underneath this video. It just means that you can join in with us every single week, where you can also post up your finished paintings if you want to, and have some feedback from the wonderful members that we have over there. We are a fantastic group. Everyone is super friendly and we are a fast growing community, so do consider joining us there if you'd like to just watch our work being posted up, or of course join in yourself. And as I said, you can have access to the free line drawing and reference photograph once you've joined us over there. So once again, you can see I'm dropping in this pigment like this, making sure that it blends into the paper, as you can see. Let the paper do the hard work for you, but as it settles, use the tip of your brush just to outline like this and move it into the corners of the pencil line. Just using the tip of my spotter brush like this. This is a number 4 size spotter. You'll see me applying the paint there and just cleaning my brush into the water, patting it on that kitchen paper and just blending it out. Now, I have got a full video on how I blend my paint or apply my paint to different types of paper, which I'll link in the description box underneath this video if you'd like to watch that also. Switching brushes to a number 2 size and just once again wetting that paper before dropping in that burnt umber. As I said at the start of this tutorial, the paints I've chosen are made by Mungyo, and they are kind of, I suppose they're a student grade paint, but they are a fantastic quality and the colour payoff is excellent. So if you're starting out painting and looking for a brand, I really recommend these paints. But if you have your own set and you have these colours within your own kit, then please use whichever colours you have. And if you have any difficulty matching up your colours, perhaps you could let me know and I'll try to help you. You'll see how easy it is to maneuver the paint when the paper is wet. Now, when I'm applying the second layer of water here, you can see it has got a tiny bit of pigment within it, but it doesn't matter too much because we are going to be painting over it. But I'm leaving the kind of bluey grey areas free of water because I want to kind of retain those and really enhance them when I come to my finished painting. So once again, just letting that paint settle for a moment or two and dropping in the burnt umber with Vandyke brown mix and of course the burnt umber on its own. Just dropping in those colours as you can see. Staying out of the grey blue tone like this, and once again blending it with a soft brush. I'm just dropping in these base colours where I feel they are needed. Now, I'm just using the reference photograph as a guide. We're not going to be absolutely following it to the letter. It's just to give us an idea of where we are going to be applying the paint. I really wanted to simplify the process for people who maybe are new to watercolour painting, and as I said at the start, to achieve something that can give you a little bit of a boost and have something you can be proud of. Just blending in the paint like this with a damp brush. It's all about glazing your watercolours. Once again, now that the paint is dry, I'm using my flat synthetic brush just to tidy up those edges. Here you can see me pointing to the light red. This is just to give it a little bit more of a colour boost. I felt that some of the brown tones needed boosting. So once again, we are wet on wet, applying that water to the areas where we want to drop that paint. So once again, just giving that paint a moment to settle and just picking the colours off my palette like this, and once again just dropping it into that water. Now this time I'm being a little more careful where I apply the paint, making sure that I'm trying to achieve my kind of darker values, some darker tones, as well as the colour. And I'm sort of switching between the colours on my palette here. Once again, I'm not being too fussy. I just want the leaf to have different tones and different values at this stage. Constantly cleaning my brush, patting it on that kitchen towel and just blending it through. So you can see already by building up layers, we are creating some sort of dimension on the leaf, which is what we want, just by dropping in these various colours like this and working around the lighter tones. Because we haven't applied water to the sort of area of that leaf there that's folding over, you can see that the paint isn't merging onto that, which is exactly what we want. And using the tip of my number 2 size spotter, once again to manipulate that paint into the pencil line. And as that paint dries, remember just to push it into that pencil line just to make it a little bit sharper. It is much better to add a few layers of a watery mix rather than a thicker mix, simply because your watercolour can go rather muddy and untidy. Now, because I've used this sort of really good quality Arches 300 GSM cold pressed paper, it does mean that I am able to kind of manipulate the paint quite a bit. I would say if you're using maybe a budget brand or a less expensive brand of watercolour paper, then just be a little more careful when you apply the paint. Maybe don't be as robust as I'm being here. I have got different tutorials where I use a less expensive paper or a budget brand, and if you're interested in that, I'll link it in the description box underneath this video. A lot of my tutorials I use mixed media paper, which is amazing for watercolour, but again, you handle it in a very different way. I just thought I ought to mention that to you in case you're being robust with a different kind of watercolour paper. And what can happen is that your paper starts to flake away. But this is a really good brand, and it does mean that you have that ability to be a lot more kind of, like I said, robust with it. So just be mindful that the more expensive your paper, the kind of better result you'll get, I suppose. So just continuing the process on the other side, this time applying my paint with a number 2 size spotter onto the tip of the leaf here. From the photograph, I noticed that the outside edge of it is slightly darker, and even though I'm working on that grey area, that sort of bluey grey tone, it doesn't matter. I still feel that I needed to enhance the outside edge. So once I've applied the paint, I'm patting my brush onto the kitchen towel, having cleaned it. Once again, you can see that I'm blending it through like this, and as I said earlier on, I have a full tutorial on how to do this, and I will link it in the box underneath this video. So when you're working with layers that are this watery and weak, you can keep applying them. So like I said earlier on, if you're wondering why I don't apply a thicker tone to begin with, it will go muddy and it becomes very, very untidy very quickly. So if you want to achieve that good depth of colour, I highly recommend that you apply your colours carefully and slowly and take your time building them up. That way you can get a really strong depth of colour. But please make sure that your layers are dry before you apply the next. It's really, really important. Notice how I'm still staying out of that grey-blue area. We still want to retain that. It's just to give the illusion of form, and also you don't want your leaf to look flat, so it's really important that you try to keep some of the light areas as they are as you work through. So once again, everything's dry, and I'm just putting a tiny bit of light red here on the stalk, which will form our second wash. We did put a layer of a very, very pale wash of yellow ochre to begin with, but now we're painting over that with this. Just gives it another dimension, and of course you'll notice from the photograph that the stalk is a slightly more red tone. So I'm applying this to the right hand side like this, and then I'm just blending it in with a damp brush. It just means that the colour isn't flat, and I'm taking this down the length of the stem. And just cleaning my brush and just patting it dry and just blending it through like this. Now you'll notice that we have a Patreon site here, and if botanical painting is your thing and you really want to level up your watercolour with botanicals, you may want to visit us there, where we have monthly tutorials in a greater detail on how to paint botanically, and also we have other levels there as well. So if you want to support my channel and treat yourself to some further tuition, which are of course ad-free, then do take a look at us there. So back to this tutorial. So once again, everything's dry and I've cleaned down my palette, so we can start to think about creating more dimension on these little folds of the leaf like this. So you can see me adding a tiny bit of water from the tiny puddle of water that I have on my palette here. This time I'm using a number 2 size brush and just gently applying that where I want this colour to be applied. And picking up the, I think this is the yellow ochre, and just dropping it in like this. You could use yellow ochre or raw umber actually. I mean, I picked yellow ochre simply because I had it within my palette, and it does have a slightly more yellowy tone, but it doesn't really matter if you don't have this colour. You could use the raw umber, which would also work. Notice how I only applied the water to the top part of this fold, wanting to keep the underside slightly more pale. So now I can use a smaller brush. This is a number 0 size spotter, just to outline some of the veins within the leaf like this. I already have the pencil lines in. Now you'll notice this part here slightly splurged because the paint was wet, but that's exactly what I wanted it to do, and why I didn't wait for the paint to dry, because I wanted the top part of the veining to have a slightly softer look. So the bottom part was dry, working wet on dry, where you applied the paint directly onto the paper, and the top part wet in wet. And the same to this part here. And the same on the one on the right hand side. The brushes that I'm using, as I said, are from Rosemary Co. Use any brushes that you have, or the brushes that you feel comfortable with. But I've used sizes, I think number 4, number 2 and number 0. And the flat is a number 2 size. But as I said, use whichever brushes that you feel comfortable with. But for me, I think these do make paint application easy, particularly the way I paint. So once all of this is dry, we can really start to think about building up the colours. But before we do, I'm just adding another glaze of that yellow ochre just to give it another sort of depth of colour. Now, if you are using a different brand of paints and you have something like a quinacridone gold or any kind of goldy colour, that would also work here. But remember to stay out of that bluey grey tone. So once again, everything's dry, so we now give it a real punch of colour. And I'm pointing here to the colours that I'm going to be using. So we have Vandyke Brown with burnt umber, and of course a tiny bit of that light red. Now the consistency this time is a little bit thicker, and you can see me directly adding this to the paper wet on dry and blending it in with my brush as I would ordinarily do. So I'm applying the paint onto the paper like this, gently around that little fold. This is also a really good opportunity to tidy up any untidy edges. So once I've applied the colour, I've cleaned my brush in the water and I've just patted it on the kitchen towel before blending it like this. Now this time I'm starting to pull out the paint into the pencil lines where I've drawn in the veins like this. It's the start of having our veins, and it gives us a really good guide as to where we can apply them a little bit later on. So as I said earlier on, just by cleaning my brush and patting it onto the kitchen paper, it gives you the ability to blend that paint into the existing washes that we've applied earlier on. Now you can see me using the tip of my brush here to paint in the central vein. Notice how it's not a strong, steady line, but more a kind of broken, sort of bitty line. And I've just used a sort of stippling motion to pat that in. I'm just returning my attention back to this kind of lovely dark reddy brown colour here, and I've applied a wash straight onto the paper of light red, and you can see me mixing a thicker puddle of Vandyke brown and just applying this around the outside edge of that folded leaf just to create another dimension and to make it really stand out. And of course using this opportunity to sharpen up any edges that may be a little bit untidy at this point, and once again blending it through. So if you are enjoying this tutorial, please consider subscribing. We have new content coming out every Tuesday, full-length tutorials every single week. And if you join us on Instagram, you can have a sneaky peek into upcoming tutorials and little sketches that I might be doing, that sort of thing. I will link everything in the description below. So if you consider subscribing, that would really, really help support me. And also if you hit that little bell notification there, you'll be notified every time I post new content and you won't miss anything at all. So once again, turning my attention now to that beautiful reddy brown colour, and I'm just dropping in wet on wet here just to give it that little splurge and make it a little bit easier to apply the the light red colour mixed in with a tiny bit of the burnt umber. I'm mixing a tiny puddle of the indigo. It's very similar to Payne's grey if you're familiar with that particular colour. I think paint colours do vary considerably from brand to brand. You could use Payne's grey or indigo for this just to enhance those kind of greyish blue colours that we applied in the beginning. Colour is relative, so when you apply your darker tones you may find that you need to strengthen your lighter tones as well just to make them a little bit more uniform. So I'm just adding this colour where I feel it is needed. And once again blending it through. So you need to be a little bit patient with watercolour, and as I've said, make sure that every layer is completely dry. So everything's dry. Now once again we can start to put that punch of colour back in by using the same colours as before, but this time we need it to be an even thicker consistency. Now the paint mustn't be too dry because it can make application too tricky. We want the consistency of the paint to be kind of gloopy, if that makes sense, so plenty of pigment. And you can see here the colours that I'm mixing, same colours as before, but in slightly different ratios. We have the light red with burnt umber and of course a little bit of indigo mixed in here and there just to give it that punch of colour that we need. Now using this brush, which is a number 0 size spotter, I'm enhancing the outside edge to begin with, once again blending it through. This will give it a lovely sharp outside edge, and because we have the white contrast of the paper, it makes it really stand out and pop off the page. A sort of a trait of mine is to really enhance the outline of my paintings. It's entirely up to you how sharp you want to make them. If you prefer a looser watercolour painting, then you don't need to do that. I'm going over the veins now and painting in the ones that I didn't do at the beginning. Once again, sort of leaving a gap in between. We don't want it to be a sort of strong solid line. We want it to look as natural as we can. This time I'm mixing a tiny bit of raw umber and just adding it to the outside edge of that folded leaf, and of course the top like this. So I'm just adding a tiny bit more of that brown tone, and you can see the colours that I'm picking up off my palette and just building up those colours bit by bit until they are at the strength of colour that I need. Now the underside of this folded petal here on the left, I felt had a little bit of a shadow underneath it, so I'm using the mix of indigo and of course there was a tiny bit of Vandyke brown, and it just, by enhancing and outlining it like this, it just gives the illusion of there being a tiny bit of a shadow where that is folded over, and I'm just blending in that hard edge with a damp brush as before and painting in those veins. Just continuing the process like this, adding the veins and any sort of smaller areas where I want to apply the darker tones like this. Just switching between the colours on my palette where I feel it is necessary, and this particular vein here that you can see me painting in at the moment almost has like a double side like this. It was a very gentle switch between the sort of two stronger veins. Very sort of gentle gap between the two of them that I felt I wanted to pop in just like that. So I'm mixing a tiny bit of the red tone again and just applying that where I feel the colour is a little bit weak. Once watercolour paint is dry, it does tend to dry a little bit lighter, so it may be sometimes you have to, or you may need to, apply some more colour once it is dry. But once again, because we've applied the colours in lighter, sort of more thinner washes, we can certainly add a bit more colour as we need to. I'm applying a tiny bit of the light red to the outside edge of the stem of the leaf like this, and then once again blending it through. I'm using, this is a number 2 size spotter, but it's a different brand. So I would say it's probably the equivalent of a number 0. So use a fine brush that you have if you want to outline any areas, as I'm doing here. I'm sorry that my hand is in the way right at the moment, but I promise you I'll move it in a second. I'm just outlining the overlap of this leaf here. And you can see by doing that, it just makes it stand out a little bit more. And of course it tidies up any of the outside edges like this. So where some of the edges are a little bit untidy, you can strengthen them up now. I notice where the this part of the leaf kind of folds over. I needed to strengthen that outside edge because we've lost it a little bit with all the washes and glazes that we've done. So using the tip of the brush here, this is a really great opportunity to strengthen up any edges, to make it more apparent that that's a little fold over, and to sharpen any edges. So if you do want to continue building up your colours, you can of course do that, and until you reach the level that you're happy with. It's your painting, you can do whatever you want to. But like I said, I rather like the kind of muted tones within this leaf, as if it's almost fading. I quite like that sort of style. I'm mixing a little bit of water with the pigments on my palette now because I want to add some veining to these overlaps. Now, because this is the underside of the leaf, they are a little bit lighter, so I'm adding water to the pigment before I add the veins. I'm just adding another glaze, which is a colour on top of a colour, just to enhance it a tiny bit before I start making the final adjustments. So it's just a matter of applying the paint like this and repeating the process. So I'm going to stop talking and let you enjoy the rest of this tutorial. I'll put some nice music on for you to listen to, so relax and enjoy, and I will see you next Tuesday.